Well, it's windy and it's hot. Public housing, everybody's business. For years, we've seen various governments at the state and federal level tackle the issue of housing. Now currently we have a housing crisis, and that housing crisis is related to one thing and one thing only: the total domination, that's right, the total domination of the housing market by the private sector, and legislation which gives significant tax breaks to investors in residential property, which is more than what state governments and the federal government pay for social and public housing. Now, before I get into this, I want to define a few things, because if there's one thing that's happened over the last decade, is the term public has basically been taken out of the conversation as far as housing is concerned. And people use terms like community housing, social housing, affordable housing, and the list goes on and on. The fact is that public housing is publicly owned and publicly managed. Affordable, social, community are terms which are used to describe privately owned housing. Whether that housing is privately owned by charities or not-for-profit groups is not the issue. The issue is that they are privately owned. And over the past 10 years, we have seen significant attempts being put in place which have all but privatised what's left of the public housing sector in this country. Today, social, affordable, community housing and public housing make up less than 3% of the housing stock in this country. While 33% of Australians rely on social security benefits to survive, only 3% find themselves in community, social, affordable and public housing. So how have we come to this in this country? Now, in many sovereign nation states around the world, investors cannot buy into the residential property market unless they are citizens. In this country, over the last 30 years, we have seen an open slather approach to housing, where anybody from any corner of the world can buy residential property. And if you're a citizen, it gets better. The more homes you buy to rent, the greater your tax deduction. In a situation where young people can't use superannuation to pay for a deposit on their homes, we have investors legally obtaining tax breaks which are more than states and federal governments pay in terms of community, social, affordable and public housing. And to make matters worse, especially in the state of Victoria, which is at the forefront of privatising the public housing sector, we are seeing government after government, both government and opposition, promoting a policy of putting private housing before public housing and privatising what's left of the public housing market, pushing people into short-term contracts. So what's so good about public housing? What makes it important? And why do we talk about public housing as everybody's business? Now, a lot of people who are buying a property, or even renting a property, or even investing in property, have no idea how integral public housing is to creating a cohesive society. No idea. When you put people with problems in the same housing block, obviously you are going to get problems. And the fact is, what little public housing there is the type of public housing that does not satisfy even the most basic human needs. Lack of maintenance, lack of security, lack of renovations, and the list goes on and on. So why are we in this situation? Why are people paying between $500,000 to $1 million for a property in a major urban centre across this country? And in some places, like Sydney, the average price is up to 1.2, 1.3 million. Why do we find ourselves in this situation? And what are the consequences when we leave housing to the private sector? What are the consequences? And that's the key. There are major consequences, and that's why public housing is everybody's business. Now, our Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, who got free tertiary education, whose mother was on a social security pension, a single parent's benefit, who was brought up in public housing, would never find himself in this situation in 2026, where the social ladder that public housing provides for people in difficult circumstances has been sawn away. So what is so good about public housing? It is secure housing. Unless you do something outrageous, it is secure housing. And that's the key. The rents are limited to 25% of income. So if you're on a social security benefit, you don't have to pay 60 to 70% to keep a roof over your head in an open, so-called open market. It is 25% of your pension. And even more importantly, if you have children, it provides that stability that is necessary to create a cohesive society. People who are renting, their children find themselves in many situations moving from school to school to school during their education, as parents have to leave when leases come to an end. So you've got interruption in education. In public housing, you can go to the same primary school, you can go to the same high school, and more importantly, you have the same friends, the same social network. And those people who complain about the fact that people with problems are put into the same block need to remember it doesn't have to be like this. In the 1980s and the 1990s in Victoria, there was a spot purchasing program. What a spot purchasing program meant is that the government would spot purchase a house in suburbs around the state. Urban centres, regional centres, rural centres. And what you would find, and I can vouch for this, what you would find is that people would establish routes, would send their kids to the same schools, the same sporting clubs, form relationship with people who are involved in full-time work, people who are investors, and be part of a greater community, instead of being ostracised and marginalised and put in soulless towers in the middle of the city. So how do we overcome this problem? Now it's very simple. Everybody says it's all about money. And in many regards it is about money, but it's about politics. It's about policies. And currently the only policies that have been pursued by both state and federal governments in this country are policies which assist the private sector. Whether it's first home grants, whether it's stamp duty, not having to pay stamp duty, whether it's giving builders money, whether it's changing regulations to make it much simpler for builders to build investments, properties. The fact is that in a situation where an important part of everyday life is dominated by the private sector, there is no competition. There is no competition between community, social and affordable housing in the private sector because it is one and the same thing. Competition can only occur between the public and the private sector. If there is no public housing stock or minuscule amounts of public housing stock, there is no competition. Prices escalate, rents escalate. So there are two main ways in which you can improve public housing stock numbers. It doesn't require a revolution. A simple act of parliament, whether at the state or federal level, will do. Let's not forget that state governments around the country obtain billions of dollars in stamp duty revenue every time somebody changes a home and buys a new home. They have to pay stamp duty. And if a property is worth $1 million, we're talking about $80,000 to $90,000 on top of that for stamp duty. Even if it's $500,000, you're looking at $30,000 to $40,000. Now the Victorian government will collect anywhere between $8 to $10 billion in stamp duty revenue, which is obtained through putting stamp duties on residential properties, on the sale of on the purchase of residential properties. Extraordinary. And what happens to this money? It goes into consolidated revenue. It doesn't go into increasing public housing stock. It requires a simple parliamentary majority, either the state or federal level. There's no point putting billions of dollars of taxpayers' money into the private housing sector to solve the housing crisis. They are the problem. Now another way where you don't even have to raise revenue as far as building public housing is concerned, or spot purchasing public housing around the country, is that to remove the tax breaks that investors receive for investing in residential property. Not actually building residential property, but actually buying residential property. It's extraordinary. There's only 2 places in the world, and Australia is one of them, where investors in residential property get a tax break. As I said at the beginning, more money is lost in taxation revenue from the tax breaks which residential property investors receive than all state and territory governments and the federal government spend for public housing, community housing, social housing, affordable housing. I am sick and tired of those people least able to defend themselves, who become the victims of ideological politics by governments who somehow believe that the only way forward is to privatise anything that is publicly owned. We've seen it in this country over and over and over and over again. Privatising public assets does not decrease prices. If we had a reasonable public housing stock by removing taxation break for residential property investors and using that money to build public housing, and even set up a public housing company at the state and federal level to build public housing on federal land or state land, or spot purchase, more importantly spot purchase around the country, you could solve this country's housing crisis within a decade. You could house over 1 million Australians in public housing in less than a decade. So what happens as the public housing sector increases and the number of people who find themselves in public housing increases? As public housing increases, that's government owned and government managed increases, what happens is that investors will leave the residential property market. As investors leave the residential property market at the lower end, prices will drop. As prices drop, young people will be able to enter the residential property market, and more importantly, those people who are not in public housing will see their rents drop because of increased competition, because of the increased number of public housing units in the country. It is simple arithmetic. It is so simple, but the trouble is it's so hard to convince anybody in authority, anybody who makes decisions, that this should be the way forward. So what are the social consequences? If you have children from exploited, disadvantaged, ostracised situations, having a stable roof over their head, having a stable education, not having to move, not having to face the problem of homelessness, being able to join the same sporting clubs, go to the same functions as their little friends, then you increase social cohesion, you decrease crime. And this is why it's everybody's business. Because while having a roof over your head is a major issue for an increasing number of people, crime increases, especially petty crime. So even for the richest people in this country, having a strong public housing sector means increased personal security for them and their property. So increasing the public housing stock is a win-win situation for everybody. But as I said before, unfortunately, with this drive to privatise publicly owned and publicly managed housing, what's left of it, about 1% of the housing stock in this country, what we see is more and more problems arising regarding destruction of social cohesion, regarding social and psychological issues for people who have got no permanency as far as their housing needs are concerned. And another thing, if you own a small business, public housing is good for you, not just in terms of increased security. But the fact is that if you only pay 25% of your income to pay for rent in publicly owned and publicly managed housing, 75% of that income can be used for goods and services. Instead of if you're paying 60 to 70%, you've only got 30 to 40%. So it's also a boost to the economy. So it's a totally win-win situation. Housing prices drop, rents drop, social cohesion increases, crime decreases, psychological, problems in the community decrease. And I could go on and on. It's a tragedy. It's a 21st century tragedy that ideology is the sole driver of providing residential housing stock for this people's population, Australia's population. It is a total tragedy and will only change until you demand, and that's the key word, demand, increasing publicly owned and publicly managed residential housing stock, preferably through spot purchasing properties around the country.